All right, we are continuing with a discussion of the broader patterns of evolution. This lecture and the next lecture are covering similar ground in a macroevolutionary context. That's what we're building up to. And your final lab in this section of the course is on macroevolution, using examples from horses. And I'll introduce that today, these examples of horse evolution, to help introduce that lab. This week is your final lab in phylogenetics, right, with the primate phylogenetics. You've already had some intro to primates, so some feedback there. I'll talk about adaptive radiation, which has come up already, this whole idea of new lineages forming in island contexts that so stimulated Darwin and his contemporaries. And I'll look at some examples and how it sheds light on evolutionary pattern and process, evolutionary tempo and mode, which are traditional terms, a phrase, a book written by one of the architects of the modern synthesis, Tempo and Mode in Evolution, by Simpson. Tempo referring to the rate of evolution, mode referring to the shape of evolution. And we'll try to unpack what all that means. And then introduce punctuated equilibrium, which is something you may have heard of. At least it was part of popular culture. You can still see cars in Berkeley with bumper stickers that say, "Honk if you love punk eek," which is a reference to punctuated equilibrium. Those were more popular, those bumper stickers, maybe in the 1980s, but hey, it's still very much a current source of study relating to the shape of evolution. We'll talk about that and the tempo. And then we'll look at another question that we opened up earlier on, how complex adaptations arise in evolution. For example, the eye. We'll look at the eye example, the one that Darwin was challenged on. How can such a complex structure such as the eye evolve? And we'll look at mechanisms of evolution involving exaptation and tinkering, this concept of working with what's available rather than inventing things anew, working with what's available, and then thus innovating with the materials at hand. That's part of those concepts. All right, all of these things today. And then looking at islands now. Let me see if I can get, because this is a cool recent video. I don't have the credit up here. I'll get the credit onto your slides. But a recent video showing the birth of islands in ocean, literally, in real time, the way volcanoes erupt underwater and that molten lava cooling in contact with the water can form new islands, right? And this is how the Galapagos were formed. It's how the Hawaiian Islands are formed through this process. And these volcanoes are essentially underwater mountains, volcanoes, from the seafloor. They can be extremely tall. If you drained the ocean, you'd have an extremely tall volcano peeking its head up above the ocean surface, right? So that is how, literally, islands may evolve, and that's the story of the Hawaiian Islands. Your big island here, Hawaii, is the youngest in this archipelago. The oldest islands are to the northwest, right? And the idea here, it relates to plate tectonics, but in a somewhat unique way from the way plate tectonics functions to create volcanoes at the continental shelves. This is an archipelago that's far from the continents. And the hypothesis is that the Pacific plate, in moving in this direction, is passing over a hot spot deep under the lithosphere. And so the plate, in moving over a deep hot spot, creates volcanic activity. And as a result of the plate's movements, the older islands get carried toward the northwest, and the younger islands form down here in the southeast. thus the ancient nature of these relative to these. And what's happened on the Hawaiian Islands, they're relatively young. What's happened is that you've had adaptive radiations of the nature that Darwin was interested in, that I've described multiple times on the patterning of island hopping of species. And Drosophila, the fruit flies famous for the work on laboratory genetics on these organisms, have speciated like crazy on the Hawaiian Islands. It's a spectacular example of adaptive radiation. Specifically, these Drosophila flies are radiating based on differences in where they lay their eggs. Some are laying eggs on fungi, some are laying them on the leaves of plants, some on the stems of plants. They have differentiated the habitat in relation to their reproductive activity and created differences in that regard that allow them to coexist. And they've hopped from island to island and changed along the way. Don't worry about the numbers that are on this figure. I just liked the figure, but the numbers are inconsequential. Another example from Hawaii, this modest little plant, a tarweed from California or from North America, got to Hawaii and radiated there. A little plant like this that has an opportunity to travel that great distance successfully may find itself on new islands with very few competitors, with very few established large photosynthetic organisms with which to compete, and is subjected to all the evolutionary forces we've looked at and has a great opportunity in such a circumstance. And that little creature, having arrived, has radiated into all these forms, into these mounding forms, into these leafy herbaceous forms, into forms that look like, agave or maybe cactus-like forms, into small trees or woody shrubs. All these variations in morphology and ecology resulting from ecological opportunities in this new landscape. Here you have ages on the islands, showing Hawaii with an estimated age of less than 500,000 years. It's relatively young. Would that have been, and if you think of these creatures having evolved in this span of time, the oldest over 5 million, down to 1 million, down to 500,000. Well, is that time scale long enough in Darwinian terms for evolutionary processes like this to happen? Well, yeah, it must be, because that's how old the islands are, and this is the type of radiation you see. These organisms don't exist anywhere else. They don't exist on the continents. There's no evidence that they ever did. They're endemic to the Hawaiian archipelago. So certainly evolution can happen on that scale of time, that span of time. Can it happen even faster? There's good evidence from other settings that it can. And I'm speaking of organisms like plants and vertebrates here. But let's not forget about something like bacteria. We've been hearing a lot in the news recently about super bugs in hospitals, right? Antibiotic-resistant infections in hospitals. If you haven't been reading the news, that it has been widely in the news for years now. And that's evolution that's occurring as these organisms adapt to tolerate antibiotics in hospital contexts or in medical contexts. And that's evolution on a really rapid scale in bacteria, for example, which have very fast generation times, very short generation times, and rapid evolutionary potential. Well, how about something like vertebrates? Here, it's easier to understand the rapidity in bacteria, but vertebrates, fish, how quickly can fish evolve a bunch of species? These African lakes, function as islands. Thus, I had quotes on islands in one of the earlier slides, because these lakes are essentially islands of water in a sea of land, if you will, right? They're isolated habitats in a different type of habitat. So lakes like these, Lake Malawi, Tanganyika, in the East African Rift Valley, and lakes in the eastern branch of the Rift Valley, and the giant Lake Victoria that sits in between these rifts. These lakes have been islands in which evolution has occurred, specifically of cichlids, cichlid fish, which have come up previously, to the tune of evolving 400 to 500 species in these lakes, which is a lot of species. If you compare the Great Lakes of North America, Lake Superior, well, it might have 20 to 30 species of fish in it. These lakes have 400, 500 cichlids alone. Forget all the catfish and all the other fish. They're incredibly speciose. Well, when did that happen? These rift lakes are deep and ancient. Malawi and Tanganyika are deep and ancient. They hold a large quantity of the world's fresh water, the whole planet's fresh water. So much of the planet's fresh water is just in these two lakes and Lake Baikal because of how deep they are, and they're old. So that could have happened on a great time scale. But Lake Victoria, this is a shallow lake that's formed by ponding up, damming up rivers in the relatively recent past, like maybe 40,000 years ago, 40 to 50,000 years ago. And then it seems to have dried up completely 14,000 years ago. So you have almost as many cichlids in this lake as in these. And that seems to have occurred in that span of time, on a scale of 10, 20,000 years. Or a little lake called Lake Nabugabo. I always pronounce it wrong. Nabagubo. Not important, but that's a picture of Nabugabo right there. It's a fascinating little laboratory of evolution. It's a little lake off of Lake Victoria, formed by dunes that formed and separated it from Lake Victoria. This thing's only a few thousand years old, Lake Nabugabo. And in it, you've had a radiation of cichlids. So thousands of years for the evolution of different vertebrate species. These fishes are unique, maybe, in their capacity to evolve quickly. They have adaptations in their jaws. They have unique structure of their jaws that allows them to differentiate their feeding niches in specialized ways. I won't go into the details, but it involves the separation of the pharyngeal jaws into two parts that allows them to capture food and chew food with separate mechanisms. And they have complex modes of signaling in sexual selection contexts, unique features that probably allow them to speciate quickly relative to some other organisms. So these aspects of their biology that create a tempo of evolution that's rapid. But a few thousand years is fast in Darwinian terms. Darwin thought that things took much longer, or at least that's the typical interpretation of Darwin's ideas. A phyletic gradualism, right? Gradualism is a phrase we've linked to him before. Change by insensible degrees. So we can think of Darwin as ascribing to a tempo of evolution of that nature, and that would lead to a particular shape of evolution, a slow, gradual changing in morphology. I'll have a couple of diagrams in a minute that can help illustrate what shape that would imply. But remember the problem for the fossil record that suggested, because fossils don't always show those clean links in form, illustrating slow, gradual changes. So he had a problem on his hands that he answered by saying, well, it's just a bad record. The geological record is poor and doesn't capture all those fine changes. A big innovation occurred with the notion of punctuated equilibrium, a theoretical innovation, a creative set of ideas on the part of Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge. Names aren't important here, but well-known investigators from the late 20th century. And Gould and Eldredge looked at the very same evidence that everyone else had looked at in terms of the fossil record and the distribution of forms across strata over time. And they took the record literally and said, well, what if this is a decent record? What if it's not just a broken record here and the data are sufficient for an analysis of how evolution unfolded? They reasoned that in short periods of time, it's possible that in short periods of time, represented by a single stratum, you might have had a lot of change occur in form. And then over longer periods of time, you would have periods of stasis, S-T-A-S-I-S, stasis, where relatively little change occurred. So long periods of equilibrium punctuated by rapid periods of change. And that's a really different interpretation from the interpretation of phyletic gradualism, and signified a different shape to the evolutionary process. Stasis, long-term stasis, is familiar from organisms in the fossil record. Many organisms represent long periods of stasis and are sometimes called living fossils, although it's a problematic descriptor. But horseshoe crabs like these, you can see them on beaches today, sometimes breeding in massive numbers. Has anyone ever been on a beach where the horseshoe crabs are breeding? Yeah, so a few of you. Was it on the East Coast, the Atlantic Ocean? Do you remember where it was? North Carolina. Cancun. Yeah, it happens around the world. It's typical of the eastern U.S. and the Atlantic seaboard. These guys are useful in medical research too, so they're highly sought for their unique type of blood, but still doing okay, but readily harvested. And these things were basically, look at this guy from the Jurassic, 175 million years ago. Well, it's a horseshoe crab. You can see it from a distance. It's still a horseshoe crab, barely changed its overall form. Now, it could be a carnival at the molecular level in terms of changes. We can't see what's happening at the molecular level from a fossil like this in comparison to an organism like this. So there could be a lot of change happening at other levels. But in gross morphology, long-term stasis here. This is longer-term stasis than was even considered by Gould and Eldridge, but examples of extreme forms of stasis. Or the Dawn redwood trees, which you were probably introduced to in the last section, right? Metasequoia, a relative of redwoods and sequoias, that was only recently discovered. It's a great story of recent discovery in China in the 1940s. A grove of these trees was found. Soon after it had been described from the fossil record, from the Mesozoic, from dinosaur times, terrestrial dinosaur times. The fossils of these had been found and described, and then a few years later, a living stand of them was found growing in these ravines, these remote ravines in China. And then World War II happened, and there was a delay, and after global situation calmed down, an expedition was run from Harvard of scientists to go collect seeds of it. And so you have these trees on the Berkeley campus, several of them right around the building, in the vicinity of the building. And some of them date to that time because these seeds were taken and the Harvard biologists sent them to different universities and arboreta to plant. And it was a remarkable case of an ancient form for which the record was lost for many millions of years that was found to still exist today. It's a living fossil. It hasn't changed its form to too great an extent over time. Vast period of equilibrium. Darwin seemed to imply that organisms would constantly change. If this is morphology on this axis, and this is time on this axis, then your morphological features are going to gradually drift over time and slowly. And sometimes the drifting will involve a branching as two lineages split and become different things, sufficiently different that they don't maintain their integrity as one line, but become two lines. This is called anagenetic change. Just write it on the board instead of fighting with my my tablet to do it. Anagenesis. Anagenesis refers to that type of change in lineages that occurs through the gradual changes through time and can lead to new forms, as opposed to cladogenesis, where the changes are concentrated at the branching events themselves. So here, with the same axes, let's take a look at this with the same axes, right? If this is morphological change, that's a great amount of morphological change occurring in no time at all, because time is on your y-axis, right? So here's a lineage that's living through time in stasis. This would represent stasis. No morphological change. Rapid amount of morphological change in virtually no time at all, at least with reference to the geological record and its ability to capture these phenomena, and then ongoing stasis. So equilibrium punctuated by a lot of change and more equilibrium. The shape of this is different from the shape of this. This is rectangular in form. The branching pattern, it's squared. It's 90-degree angles, sometimes called rectangular. And it's cladogenesis, where the clades arise rapidly in time, and the change is concentrated at the lineage branching event. Here, the change occurs all along, as well as at the branching event. Here, it's concentrated at the splitting events themselves. And that's really gradualism contrasted with punctuated equilibrium. Let's put some organisms on it for reference. Butterflies that have different color patterns, right? So different gross morphology, different form of these butterflies. Here's starting from this relatively muted brown butterfly in the gradualism model. They would gradually change form over time, becoming more orange here, maybe with some white bands here, until they ended up as different forms. Here's your original dull model in a punctuated equilibrium context that branches to form an orange type and some other type relatively quickly. Different shapes to the process, leading to an end result that may be similar, an orange one and a white one, and maybe your original type as well. Punk geek. The real geeks will say punk geek, shorthand for punctuated equilibrium. Yes, please.
So what's a bigger factor of lack of gene flow or just rapid?
So what's a bigger factor in the punctuated equilibrium model? Is it a lack of gene flow or some other mechanism? Yeah, it's a great question, because what you're getting at is the question, I think, as to whether the mechanisms are different in punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. And that really was the heart of the debate, because when this model was advanced by Gould and Eldridge, it was taken to be anti-Darwinian. Some non-Darwinian mechanisms must be responsible for this model to work. And mostly they said, no, we're just talking about traditional Darwinian mechanisms on different timescales and concentrated in different portions of the evolution of these lineages. So they didn't introduce any new mechanisms of change. There are results from recent times, particularly in the field of evolutionary developmental biology, Evo-Devo, evolutionary developmental biology, that I'll look at in the next lecture, that can help explain periods of very rapid change that are in some ways non-Darwinian maybe, and also the types of genetic change that can lead in single generations to lineage splitting that we've already looked at with cases of polyploidy phenomena like that are relevant here, maybe, for some lineages at least. But mostly, the punctuated equilibrium folks were saying, no, we're talking about traditional mechanisms. This was a study right in the heart of that debate that seemed to support a punctuated equilibrium model. Again, these Great Lakes of Africa, in this case mollusks, and the shape of the evolution of the mollusk tree in these African lakes. Looking at fossils, an excellent fossil record going way back in time. These organisms seem to have periods of stasis punctuated by rapid change, continued by periods of stasis. It was just an example of support for punctuated equilibrium that was published in in the major journal of the world, Nature, and received a lot of press. It's also received significant challenges since then. But there was and is evidence to support a punctuated equilibrium model. Just a reminder about the doors. I've had multiple requests to try not to slam doors on your way out and in. Those things slam and can be disruptive. Horses are a real interesting case study in this context, and they'll be the focus of your lab next week. Horses have been studied in evolutionary contexts for a long, long time. Textbook sort of example. There's a lecture this morning, 10 a.m. on this campus, in this building, on the evolution of horses. So if you want the details on that, it starts at 10. And it's taking a genomic approach to modern horses, but the data shed light on these ancient patterns in interesting ways. So the horses are just fascinating. Horses are fascinating to people. The beloved noble horse, right? Where would we be today without horses? Well, they did play a huge role in our history. They evolved from modest little creatures, the size of a dog. These ancient horses from 60 million years ago. Eohippus, the dawn horse. Hippus refers to horse. Hippopotamus is the river horse. Eohippus, ancient dawn from the earliest days. The ancient horse. Well, these guys were tiny, like this, and they had lots of toes. Well, not lots. 5 or fewer is typical for vertebrates. And these guys had 4 good toes on their feet. And over time, you have this trend of increasing size and loss of toes to the modern condition where your noble horse is just running on its middle fingers and middle toes. It's running on one finger. Indeed, it's running on the distal bone and hoof of the one finger. The others having been reduced and lost completely, or just present as these little splints, which if you're an equestrian, you know about horses, that they have these 2 bones on either side, which represent the vestiges of the ancient bones of digit 2 and digit 4 that have essentially gone away. Not only has height changed and the number of toes changed, but the tooth form has changed from the ancient types that had relatively low crowned teeth. The portion of the tooth that's above the gum line is the crown, and the roots below that. Well, this is a low crowned tooth because there's a relatively small amount of crown relative to the roots. It's about equal. That's low crowned. As opposed to a high crowned tooth like your modern horse has in the barnyard, it has a very high crown and only a little bit of root. This is all the root right there. All the rest is crown. And these 3 phenomena, height, size, number of toes, and heights of teeth, have been part of an integrated story of horse evolution. Does anyone know the general contours of that story? What do all these 3 things relate to in horses? Or maybe you can just present a hypothesis. Maybe you've never heard, but can you generate any creative idea there? A room full of geniuses. I know there's stirring minds out there, but yes. Teeth had to do with a change in diet. Yes, they did. And an emphasis on foods that are harder to chew, specifically grasses. Grass is really hard to chew if you've ever tried. compared to leaves or fruit, which these little guys probably were emphasizing in more forested contexts, leaves and fruits, grasses are full of silica. They're impregnated with silica, the stuff that sand or glass is made from, right? And that wears away the teeth. So you better have a high crown on your teeth if you're going to wear it that much, or you'll wear them out and you won't be able to chew anymore. And that can happen to horses. So high crown teeth correlated with eating grass in open spaces where running is at a premium. Being tall with long legs allows you to be faster, and losing toes helps you to reduce the weight in the distal extremities and allows you to have a longer stride and a faster stride in open country grasslands as you evolve away from forests. It's a lovely story, and it fits this type of linear trajectory. But when you look at horse evolution, you see just how many lineages there are. All these different lineages named based on differences in morphology. Not molecular biology yet, but it's stirring. So what you've done when you make a story like that is essentially follow one track through this complex web of history and tell a story on that basis of that one track. You go from your dawn horse, following one track line to the modern horse, and create one linear narrative about all this complex evolution and all these failed pathways, if you want to consider them that. Yes?
Where do
Zebras are way up here. Zebras are members of the genus Equus. This very closely related to your domestic horse. You have a thing called Equus przewalski in Mongolia that's thought to be the direct ancestor of the modern horse. Zebras are closely related. There's a zebra-like creature that recently went extinct called a quagga, and I know the guy today talking has genetic data from the quagga. So they're just a horse. Yeah. Same species as your domestic horse. The ponies, yeah, all considered Equus caballus, same species as the domestic horse. So, and these lines that even a diagram like this, connecting all the dots, these are hypotheses about the evolutionary connections. In reality, you just have fossils from a certain time period. You have fossils of, there's a Parahippus here, Pliohippus, Merychippus. You have fossils that represent these different types. You may know that they run from 25 to 15 million. But to connect these up into a story involves further suppositions. So we can't naively tell these stories of linear trajectories. We have to recognize that they are hypotheses built on hypotheses. And the traditional story of horse evolution is one of gradual change relating to a modern condition that's the apex of the whole process, the noble horse of today. And it all culminated in that. Well, it was a branchy, messy process with lots of ins and outs, and we shouldn't be selective in our storytelling. We also don't need to necessarily choose between punctuated evolutionary patterns and gradualistic patterns as being one or the other. Different organisms might evolve in different ways according to their mode and tempo. And even the same organisms, one lineage, might at different times exhibit the different patterns. So as usual, we can't naively just accept one perspective. We need to hold multiple perspectives in mind. Need to be multifactorial, which will be really true in ecology, in the ecology section. Ecologists love multiple causality. So true novelties in evolution, true creativity, that's a lasting problem. How do you get something from nothing? That goes back to that old philosophical problem. What I'm going to address as one answer is this phenomenon of tinkering and the gradual building up of complex neomorphs. Remember, the eye was the problem. An organ of extreme perfection, like the eye. What good is half of an eye? It couldn't be built by natural selection step by step, because half of an eye is no good. You need the whole thing or nothing. Mollusks show a great example in the world of living mollusks, the different stages of complexity in eyes that could represent the stepping stones along which eyes evolved. Limpets, these little creatures like limpets or chitons that cling to the rocks down on the ocean shore, they have a type of eye that just is essentially a series of pigmented cells. So they can perceive light and dark only, which is useful. Better than no eye, because if a shadow crosses over them that may be a predator, may be something that threatens them, at least they know that there's something overhead and maybe they should cling tighter rather than trying to be active and moving at that time. So simple pigmented cells representing an eye are useful and functional. They don't do what the hawk's eye does, but at least it's a positive benefit to the organism and can be explained as evolving by natural selection. Organisms like nautiloids, this is a living creature called a nautiloid, still exists. Well, it has a somewhat more complex eye that functions like a pinhole camera that has an aperture that can be opened and closed to allow more or less light in and to give the organism some sense of depth of field, if you know something about the way an aperture functions on a camera. There's even a step in between that we could have drawn, just forming a cup, an eye cup. On your PDF, I have a link which you can go to for a very entertaining description of eye evolution to enliven this, that's given by Richard Dawkins, who's a popular biologist and a easy to listen to presentation on this subject. Conchs, I mean, look at those funny eyes. Starting to resemble more of what we think of as an eye, maybe, on these long stalks. Well, they have a lens that not only allows some depth perception, but allows a better focus of the image. So not only can they see depth, but some clarity of what's moving in front of them. All steps that are very useful in vision. When you get to the cephalopods, like squid and octopus and cuttlefish, you have a very complex eye with all the features, really, that we have in our eyes, including the cornea and the lens and the retina. A complex camera eye like this. But it's differently constructed from ours. It's convergent. It's convergently evolved on the vertebrate eye. Someday you must save up your money to go to a place where you can snorkel with squid, because it's an unforgettable thing when you end up with a school of squid, cephalopods, and they all turn and look at you at once with these eyes. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like you're looking at a bunch of mammals in a watery context, and they're all synchronized and changing their colors in synchrony. Organisms are not thought to be able to see color. Traditionally, that's the notion. You have a GSI in this course who's studying that right now. He's got some cuttlefish up in his lab, and he seems to be challenging that notion that these cephalopods with their complex eyes can't see color. Fascinating little study happening in the building upstairs. The hawk's eye, the vertebrate's eye, is differently constructed, as I mentioned. It's actually an inferior construction in many ways because of the way that and I don't know enough about this, but the way that the photopigment receptors are constructed, they're reversed from the cephalopod's eye, and it creates a blind spot in vertebrates because of the bundling of the nerves at the back of the eye, a blind spot for the vertebrates that the cephalopods don't have. So in many ways, the cephalopod eye is a superior construction. Well, why isn't the vertebrate eye better? That's not the way evolution proceeds, by doing the optimum. It works with what's available. Evolutionary processes can get caught in cul-de-sacs that are irreversible, and it's one of the great examples for a natural process here, because If you wanted to do this process ideally, you would construct organisms perfectly and differently. And the vertebrate eye is an imperfect construction. And certainly the cephalopod eye could be improved upon. I don't have time for this video, but I'll send you a link. It's an introduction to this phenomenon of exaptation. And it describes pitcher plants well. Pitcher plants are one of these carnivorous plants, right, that consume insects by, in the case of the pitcher plants, having a watery medium inside them that the insects fall into and end up being digested by the plant. A great adaptation on the part of plants, particularly that are living in nitrogen and phosphorus poor environments. They can't get these essential elements from the soil, so they get them from these animals that fall in and then fall into this acidic bath and get digested. The video is even more spectacular because it shows just what a complex system this is. It's not just the plants that are eating the insects, but there's a little spider that lives in there that steals the food, but in defecating and digesting these insects also feeds the plant. And then a crab that wants to eat the spiders, and as usual, it's a complex story. But the point here is about exaptation and the fact that, well, what is a pitcher? You guys know your plants, up, down, left, and right now. What is this? This is modified leaf, yes. These are modified leaves. So this organism, in needing a capture device, hasn't invented a whole new organ for capturing insects. It's modified leaves. It's tinkered with stuff it already had. Tinkerbell, I've learned from my daughter, was, that's in the root of her name. Tinkerbell was a child who used to work with metal pots and pans or something like this and create teapots from them or something. I don't know. But would use the objects at hand to create new objects. She was Tinkerbell. She was a tinkerer. It's kind of an old-fashioned word that people don't say anymore. Oh, you're just tinkering over there, aren't you, Sonny, or something like that, right? No one says that anymore, but to tinker, that's the idea. And the French made it famous because they had a term that translates as tinker called bricoler, B-R-I-C-O-L-E-R. So that's where it became current in English from the French translation, because these French guys were strong on pointing out that so much of evolution happens through tinkering, working with what you have. A structure that's evolved for one function originally is exapted. It's co-opted. It's co-opted for a new function. A structure that's evolved for one function and becomes co-opted for a new function is called an exaptation. And so much of evolution has happened through that process. The Venus flytrap and its capture device is also based on modified leaves for the same purposes, capturing insects in nutrient-poor environments. Or as a final example, this topic that's come up already that's so fascinating in a modern context, the relationship of birds. And specifically now this great synapomorphy of the avian lineage, that is feathers. Feathers, you can't find feathers on anything else other than birds and their close relatives. So what are feathers? Feathers are uniquely constructed for what? For flying with, right? Well, there are a couple different types of feather. And the dinosaurs, the early dinosaurs, and there's several now, there's several nice ones, mostly from China. 120 million years for Microraptor, 125 or so for Sinornithosaurus, Sinosauropteryx, 125, around the same time here, well preserved in these slabs of material, showing evidence for feathers on the bodies of these creatures. These tend to be the little downy type feathers, the down feathers, the fluffy little ones that young birds have the type that are good for your sleeping bag or your comforter because they're particularly insulating and warm. Maybe that's why feathers evolved in these little creatures, to keep them warm, eh? It's a good possibility given the fact that you're not seeing the long asymmetrical feathers typically used in flight on these ancient forms. So see how you have a scenario here whereby you could have downy feathers evolving in the precursors and those feathers being exapted for flight in creatures like Archaeopteryx, the famous transitional organism between dinosaurian reptiles and modern birds. And there are intervening possibilities with feathers between insulation and flight too, because feathers are rich in signaling possibilities. So they could also be co-opted for patterns in sexual selection and even flight after that. A few different scenarios possible to test with the fossil record and molecular studies potentially. All right, all set for today. Have a nice week.